Sex Party with your host, Dustin Rybka.
Hello and welcome to Sex Party. I am your host, Dustin Rybka. How are you guys doing out there? Are you stressed? Are you really stressed? Or are you just ready to explode and shoot candy corn out of your eyeballs? I have no idea what that means, but we're going to go with it. Because on this episode, I talk with Melissa Novak. Melissa Novak is a licensed clinical social worker and a certified sex therapist. And we talk about stress. We talk about what the pandemic is doing, what it's done, all of the fun things that's happening there. We also have a little brief conversation about the sex scene from Jerry Maguire. And if you stick around to the end, you're going to find out something very, very strange and just completely wrong about the state of Alabama. So enjoy my conversation with Melissa Novak.
This week's conversation.
Melissa Novak, hi, how are you doing today? Welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you?
I'm really, really well, actually.
That's
very well.
Great, especially during a pandemic, we'll take what we can get.
Yeah, it's hard to figure out, like, are we mid-pandemic? Are we 3/4 pandemic? Are we pandemic?
I have no idea. Honestly, I'm just like, okay, whatever. I just keep staying in my home.
It's probably the best. Staying in your home for me, it's starting to drive me a little crazy. So
Right.
I have been safely getting out there.
I mean, I was just up in Chicago actually this past weekend and just to do a little bit more work and things like that. So I'm still getting out a little bit, but it just still feels like I feel like traveling now feels as though you're moving through like sand or like what's it called, quicksand, everything feels a little harder.
I mean, I think everything is harder in general, and I think and I've spoke about this on the show with other guests, but like especially with you and what you do, it's got to play like an insanely crucial role to like the already difficult things that are happening with people that come and see you or want to speak to you or get your expertise on something. I mean, maybe you can speak a little bit on how the pandemic has just really frazzled everybody, but in the sex department.
Oh, I mean, I think that's really sort of been fascinating for all of us. Although, what's sort of happening in real time is that therapists are having and healers are having to go through the exact same stressors, but like, as their patients. And as the people that they're trying to work with. And that is a really different experience as a healer. My patients have sometimes we've had similar experiences or things in our lives have, matched up, but I've never been sort of in a collective, high intense situation for this long period of time, going through it with them and trying to like deal with my own stuff while like also providing support. So I think that's been something that has really shifted the therapy dynamic in lots of different ways. I think in some ways it's helped humanize the therapeutic relationship. And then I think in other ways, I know a lot of healers that are really exhausted and tired and really trying to show up in important ways with their clients. And so it's been, we're all kind of in it together, and therapy has sort of shifted into that, even more into that mindset. So sexually, I think at first everyone was like, well, no one's going to be having sex because everyone's going to be stressed the fuck out. And that, I would say, is sort of like kind of both and, that there were a lot of people that are just like, I'm tired. Why don't I want to have sex? And it's like, okay, well, you have all your kids at home. You've been in the same four walls for like the last year and a half. You're dealing with all of these stressors of unknowns, that it gets very difficult to also cultivate desire during that time. And I think that has thrown people, because the pandemic is sort of this nebulous thing that we can't quite put our finger on like what it is. Like oftentimes I'll be like, well, we're also in a pandemic, and people will be like, that's not an excuse, like our life is fine. And I'm like, okay, but it's still hard, even if you are faring really well. Like there's some people that are doing really well in the pandemic, and it's been, great for them in certain ways. Even that, there's still a collective stress that is happening. And I think that that's been really hard. And it's hard to know like what to do, right? Like, is this safe? Is this unsafe? How do we make these decisions? And I think that translates a lot even into the dating field, where I think for me, what's showing up a lot for folks is like loneliness, and really sort of missing that connection. The way that I talk about, somebody else came up with this, which I think was so beautiful, is that the pandemic really is this like magnifying glass on whatever is happening, or like a volume button where it's turned up whatever was happening. So if you were in conflict before with your partner or partners or whatever, most likely that conflict has like turned up, right? It didn't go away. Or
Right.
if you weren't having sex before, most likely the pandemic has just made it so that you're not having sex still, right? And kind of turning that up.
Right. I mean, and there's so many good points in what you said, and I'm so glad you're here. Like, just that first opening shot right now. I mean, that's like amazing, because you successfully have like taken a lot of things that have been on my mind, that I know that have been on a lot of people's minds about sex, about the pandemic, about anxiety, and totally just address them. It's very straightforward. And I think that that's really difficult. I mean, because sexual anxiety is a motherfucker as it is, right? It's like the worst of the worst. It's like the one place you can't really have great sex, get to know your partner, get to know yourself, have an orgasm. Like all these things are not just affected, but sort of like halted almost because of anxiety. And I guess, coming off of that last, question, just in general, how common is sexual anxiety?
So I'm just totally biased because I feel like I see it everywhere. I just don't know a lot of people that are like, I have no worries whatsoever, romantically, physically, sexually. It would be very, I mean, dope. I'm sure there's like, I don't even know, somebody out there that's like, it's cool. But it probably, if you think it's cool, it's probably not cool. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
um, and so I think that this is one of the things where our culture, American culture, and really sort of spurs this idea of like better best, and that you should always be in some aspect of best. And I think there's a lot of issues in terms of, or a lot of motivations behind that, in terms of capitalism and how we capitalize on people's suffering. And look, I'm a therapist, so I get it. But we, if you think about like, this vitamin, or are you feeling sluggish or tired or whatever, like take this thing. And I think that's where we've sort of said like, oh, if there's a problem, there should be a solution and I should be able to purchase it, which is a very sort of privileged nation mentality, and also just the nature of marketplace well-being, right? Where essentially it's this idea that you should be always operating at optimal, rather
Right.
than really understanding the human experience of like variability. And I think there's a lot of judgments. I mean, I grew up in St. Louis, very sort of like pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of idea and or mentality in a lot of ways and approach to things. And if you think about it, it's this idea that like I should be here, and if I'm not, then like what do I need to bring me to that? So it's not,
Right.
to me, people just take that and they put it into their sexual realm. Oftentimes they're, doing just fine, but fine is very anxiety provoking because it feels sort of ambiguous and uncertain. And I think makes people very nervous. And really, so I think it's fine. And then I also think there's this other component of dealing with the uncertainty of potential rejection. And I always joke that, like, if there's one thing I'm really good at, well, it's failing and being rejected. Like, I have very intimate knowledge of this experience. And so I think that a lot of people have sort of thought, like, well, we're not I'm not supposed to be rejected in any sort of way, and really trying to help folks reframe that a little bit for this idea of like, oh, this is just like an incompatibility, right? Like you have this want and need, and they have this want and need, and your crazies don't match, right? I always say you have to find
Yeah.
somebody that matches your crazy, um, rather than this idea that, oh, you should just fit into whatever, right? And like we should just make this work, which is different than compromising. Compromising is one aspect, but this idea of like molding yourself into being something different or foregoing your needs is not a compromise. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense, and it actually it sort of highlights something just in general in dating that I has been on my mind that I've wanted to bring up on the show for a while, and that is that I feel like I don't know if you lived maybe not in a big city or even if you did, but like 10 years ago when there wasn't a bunch of dating apps, like people were just like meeting each other. Like, oh, my friend's boyfriend has this friend. So you meet that person and oh, he's cool, she's cool, whatever. And you just like if you can like each other just enough, you sort of like start a relationship, and then there's like some like mishap at the bowling alley or whatever, and you're like, oh, why is he like this or whatever, and it's like because you're not like shopping around, you just went with the first thing that, and now you're upset because that person is not who you thought they were going to be. I mean, it's very bizarre because that was then, and now we have these like dating apps. If I don't like someone, I have a bad date, I can just swipe right on whomever, go out with another girl, whatever it is. There's a lot of choice there. And I think that right there, where the way it was before, the way it is now, it sounds great, but I don't think people are shopping. I think they shop or they explore their options more for a car or a pair of shoes rather than they do a relationship, because there's this sort of belief that like it's magic and I'm gonna grab the apple at the same time they in the store, and it's like, and I think that leads to a lot of fucking anxiety because it's not working out, it's not happening the way you met your husband, and no one's talking about anything bad, everyone's only sharing the good stuff, so it's hard for people to know anything. So to me, what you're saying, it's like, yeah, you're getting mad at someone for being themselves, and you didn't really get to know this person before you started dating them. And I think that's a huge problem.
I think that, if we're, so I hear you talking about like a bunch of different components here, and
Right.
like this is gonna be my little soapbox. I always, it's
Sure.
like really fun for me to talk about dating because I was so terrible at it,
Yeah.
or I was so like, I don't know that I was terrible. I was not very successful at it,
Right.
and, or at least it didn't feel like it. But even still, like, right? Like, even hearing that narrative is what is successful dating? What does that mean? Right? And and so I think there's some things that I've seen that have happened a lot in dating, and that I think have sort of happened both culturally and with different. And look, I'm not going to shit on social media. I don't. It's too overwhelming for me. It's like too much noise. So I am not. I'm not good at it. I don't like it stresses me out mostly because it triggers all my shit around like I want to be liked and I get way too like
Right.
caught up in stuff. Just even thinking about it is making me sweat. So I it's just like too much for me. But I think one of the things that can be really hard is when you're on social media, you're often curating yourself and the moment and these experiences, and we're looking at other people's curations as well, right? And while I really love a lot of the people that are posting sort of like realness checks or whatever, where they're like, this is me real, right? And this is me like, I don't know, posing in a certain way or doing something. Um, I think that's really incredible. And I also think, how do we actually take in that information of variability, of uh, really sort of challenging a lot of the comparison stuff that we do? And I think that that is all kind of keyed into this idea of like optimal. There's a lot of research around what's called maximizers versus sacrificers. And maximizers are, I think, quintessential Americans. Um, in that the idea is like everything should be bigger, better, like more, I want to make the best decisions. If I have any regret, it's garbage. If I have any disappointment, it's garbage, right? Like, my husband and I just went out to this really nice dinner, like really nice dinner. And like one of the dishes was a little like off. And we were just like, oh, and it was like, okay, this is like a really fucking nice, like it was a great. And so we were joking about how much like before when we first got together, like that dinner would not have even been a possibility, right? And here we are kind of being like, yeah. Like it was just ridiculous. And so we had to
Right.
really like realign and like laugh at like, oh yeah, variability. And also that's what makes certain special moments where everything kind of comes together beautifully so beautiful. And we can't expect that every time. So maximizers are these folks that are like, they will ruminate and perseverate on their decisions because they are so worried that they are going to choose wrong. And so they will go and go and go. And they will sort of sometimes even be paralyzed with indecision. And then you have sacrificers, which are like, what's good enough? And if you can imagine, who do you think is happier?
Right. Definitely the latter.
Yeah, the sacrificers. And I think this is where we have a lot of all or nothing thinking in our culture. When people think of sacrificers, they're like, well, obviously, I just have to give everything up. And it's like,
Right.
okay, slow down. Right? Like, what for me, for example, I've really been cultivating more and more of a sacrificer mentality because I've realized, like, oh, this is like one, I can get that indecision paralysis and it stresses me out. And so I'm like, I just need to make a decision. Like, just pick one. And there's
Right.
some privilege that can come with that for sure. But then the other thing is that uh, I've seen at least the freedom that can come from that. And if you take anything, if anybody takes anything from this conversation, it's figuring out like, what is my relationship to good enough? And how do I actually embrace that rather than trying to always go for peak? Because we have what's called hedonic adaptation. So when we have anything that's peak, eventually it's like, okay, right? Like think about something that you've been either really looking forward to or you couldn't wait to get or whatever, right? And then you get it and you're like, cool, I have it.
Yeah.
right?
Right. Next.
So, yeah, on to the next thing. And so, this is where I think what maximizers can miss at times, and what our culture really misses, is that we are, there are so many opportunities to really sort of shift things a little bit, where it's not that you're going to think everything's going to suck, right? Because I know a lot of people that are like, well, I just don't want to be disappointed, so I'm going to think it's shit. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not, this isn't great either. That's not what a sacrificer does, right? But a
Oh
sacrificer sort
God.
of understands that there's this variability in our human experience, and that it's better to just make a decision and have like okay, I experience some stress, I make a decision and I move on, than just go to stress, 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 which really pressurizes the situation. And if you think about that sexually, it's no different, right? So if you're
Right.
like, oh, we're gonna be fucking like Tom Cruise and that one chick up against the wall and Jerry Maguire, it's like, do y'all know how much forearms and also just penis orifice logistics, like that is not easy to do. And she's
Nope.
getting busted on her back so hard because he's got to use leverage in that. I'm not trying to
Right.
shit on it. If you can do it, high five to you. That is just not my, that is not my life. And that is
Yeah.
okay for me. But this is
Yeah.
something where I think people think, oh, but we should be doing this, or it should be. It's kind of like watching porn and being like, oh, I should be doing that, versus like, if you, I always tell people I love porn, but when you watch the Olympics and you see someone like um Shakari, I think Shakari Robinson or Hussein Bolt or what, I'm not a big Olympics watcher obviously, but you see them running and you're like, "Oh, that's how you run? I should just go do that. Let me run a
Right.
quick 40." And nobody
Yeah.
would ever be like, they might be like, I want to do that. But do you want to train for that? Do you want, like, do you also have the ability for that? Or can we let that go and focus on what you do have? And the porn is no different. You are literally watching athletes
Mm-hmm.
fuck.
Yeah.
That's it, like,
Yeah.
you're watching body types that are variable and often
Curated.
yeah. Well, and right, versus for certain standards and looks and aesthetics, right?
Yeah.
And I think so this is where I think Marty Klein coined the term porn literacy, and just even media literacy. Like, how are we being literate about what actually the standards we're holding ourselves to? I feel like I'm going all over the place.
Yeah, but that's okay because this is like a huge topic, and I think you know sexual anxiety comes from all of these different directions, from seeing the dude with the chicks and the Lambo on Instagram like 95 times a day, be like, well, I suck, I don't have that. And then like watching porn as a woman, watching porn as a man, and seeing what you said and not realizing like, hey, this is a show. Like, these people train for this. These are fucking pros, man. These are rock stars. This is a concert, like
It takes
they don't want to be there for six
It
hours, but
takes
they
like
are.
8+ hours. They are icing afterwards. They are like,
Yeah.
like the people that I know that do porn are like, I mean, again, these are athletes. Like, they train for this shit. And most of the time they'll be like,
Yeah.
this is not how I fuck in real life. Like, this, I think there's
No.
even, if you like Google porn stars talk about how they actually have sex or something, like, there's some
Right.
sort of YouTube or something on this where like people are just like, yeah, that's not how it goes.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine, and she's like, I just had to stop watching porn because it's not real. And I'm like, yeah, no, I get it for sure. And she's like, and we were talking about like different kinds of porn, different genres, whatever. And I'm like, that's why I watch porn. And she's like, what do you mean? I'm like, because I'm trying to get out of reality when I'm watching porn. I'm like going to like the fantasy, the fun,
Yeah.
crazy, fucked up, crazy shit, because it's not in my normal life. Well, not every day, but like, whatever. And she's like, "Oh my God, I'm gonna watch porn again. You're so right. I'm like, so it does mean a lot that you just totally frame that. Like when you go into it, just know it's a fantasy. You know what I mean? Know that you're,
Right.
when you're watching like, the Avengers, you're not gonna go out on the street and like punch someone who or
Right.
whatever. Like come on, man. Like so I think that's a really amazing point to make, but also I have a question on that too, and it's like, how did we get to this place where porn is being like considered by some people viewing it as that's how I should be in bed? Is that from like years and years and years of people trying to sweep porn and sexuality under the rug, and now it's like coming back out?
Mm,
And so this is that why people, I just feel like I don't know, you always hear like in Europe, they're very open about pornography and naked people and whatever, and they have less sex crime, less this, and this. I don't know if it's true. I haven't studied the statistics at all. But I always found that fascinating. When you try and hide something from someone, they just want it more. And now we're at this place where we have people who are growing up on, I mean, I grew up on porn, and now kids that are coming up underneath me, that whole generation, they've got the internet and phones and iPads and, whatever. So it's like, it's just getting the thing that they tried to turn into a problem, is now coming back to haunt, the culture. So that, and I love porn. You know what I mean? I know it's fantasy, and I think that's the big, it's fun to try that stuff in real life, but you have to have two people who are like willing to do it. Like you said, the Jerry Maguire thing, you always end up knocking over the bookshelf
I
and someone
mean,
gets
it's a
hurt.
mess. It's like it
Yeah.
seems so good in theory. Like I think that, one thing I wish people would approach sex with is just a little more humor. And like, I mean, it is absurd. We are literally taking
Yes.
two bodies or more or other things and like smashing them together with, there's fluids, there's things happening that normally we'd be like, ooh, okay. And it's like, this is dope. So I think, it's not always the way that I always frame things for folks is I say, okay, so if we think about life, sex, relationships, any of this, it's going to be about 10% holy shit dope. And then we've got like another 10% that's just going to be like, oh, maybe a little more than that, maybe 20% that's like garbage. Then we've got like another little bit that's like, um, disappointing, regretful, like not the worst ever, but like not great either. And then, but the most part, I think what, there's like 50% left, that's mediocre. And that's where we mostly live. And we know Jack Morin did a lot of research on long term erotic couples. And one of the things that he found was that all the couples that were long term erotic, like they reported really satisfying, beautiful sex lives. And this was with heterosexual couples, uh, uh, lesbian couples, and gay male couples. And they reported that, or the one thing that they did was essentially like schedule sex. And everyone's always like, I don't want to schedule it. And I'm like, okay. Right? Like when did you have like free, unabashed, like just fucking like rabbits? And a lot of people will talk about in their teens or their early um 20s, and I'm like, okay. So what is different between now and then? And usually it's bills, kids, dog, work. They have all of these things that is not constantly curating sexual like vibrations, right?
Hmm.
And so, what I talked to them about, or what these couples really learned, was that, like, well, we have regular sex because sometimes that regular sex turns into exceptional sex. And then when it doesn't, we know there's going to be another time to come. So it takes some of the pressure off of every time. So it opens the
Right.
door for there to be these really like beautiful sex moments. And then also, like, if there's not a great one or it doesn't quite work out, it's like, oh, that's cool. We'll hit it back up on Tuesday. No big deal.
Right. Yeah.
And so this is
No, I
where,
mean,
like, I talk to people a lot about that. That's one of the ways of, even if you don't want to schedule it, but thinking about way, like, I like sort of like loose schedules of like, okay, we're getting it in once a week, or like looking at the schedule. And if you think about it, like, you can, the more you see scheduling as this idea of like, oh, this is exciting. If you think about it, when you were a kid in high school, you typically did this, right? Like, whose parents aren't home, where are we going to stay, what will I wear, what will they do, how will they respond, right? Like, the whole thing, you spent hours planning and scheduling interactions, most of us, you know? And so that's something that it's like, well, and they're like, I don't have time for that. And it's like, okay, so what are we going to do, right?
right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's the other. So when people come to you for help,
Mm-hmm.
with anxiety, with sex, whatever, and you say these things, do they push back on that? Because to me, that goes with what we were talking about earlier, how people think I'm going to meet this person in the produce section. It's going to be romantic. It's going to be meant to be. It's going to work out. Or it's going to have gorgeous like fuck fest all the time. It's going to be awesome. It's never going to get boring. But then when neither of those things happen, and they're like, oh, it's a human being. Like, at what point is it like time to sort of get real? Like, okay, this is another person with their own brain that you're trying to coexist with, and if you want to have sex, it's better to schedule it. Do they push back against that, like, or do they go with it
I
usually?
think there's like a both and. I think for everybody, it, you know, asking people when they come to me, they're typically exhausted. And so asking them to do something more is like, and I think we all have some disappointment around the fact that we wish things were just easier. At least I do. You know, so
Yeah.
I think that is where some of the pushback comes, and then there's also more fear around, well, if I try this and it doesn't work, right? Again, we're always, it's very sort of counterintuitive. As I keep trying to help people push against the performance model, I'm still being held to some element of performance, right? Like, you know, if you come to me and you're like, I'm having trouble with my orgasm, and I'm like, cool, let's like let it go for a second, let's do some things, but I'm still also trying to help you explore. And for me, it's really like, can we broaden your sexual landscape, right? If that's something that you want, can we broaden your sexual landscape and focus on pleasure? But I also am keeping in mind that folks really want that orgasm for whatever
Right.
reason. And it's like, okay, but we have to have some conversations in our country and with each other about like what this all means, because it's very, I think the center on orgasm is very misogynistic, and it's really about like that performative based uh sexual experience, because I know lots of human beings that vary in their um sexual experience, and like, oh, they're having orgasms when they do their solo sex stuff and they're masturbating and whatever, and it's feeling really good, but then partnered sex, they may not have the same type of orgasm, but they're having still a release. It feels whole body, it feels really different or more exciting. And I know a lot of people are like, but I want that other thing. And it's like, okay, but you're getting this really incredible experience too. Or people are like, yeah, I like both things, they're fine. And their partners are like, but I want you to have something different. And I get that a lot from heterosexual men that are so caught up in their partner's pleasure as a indicator of who they are. What they don't realize they're doing is often co-opting their pleasure, right? They're not actually asking their partner, well, what do you like and what do you want? Right? They're going, I want it to be done a certain way. I want you to respond in a certain way. And some assholes will be dicks and be like, well, everybody else responded just fine. Right? And it's like, okay, I don't, what do you want me to do with
Right.
that?
Yeah. Okay, so one, why the fuck are it, why are we as a society so against making women come?
I don't know that we're against it. I think uh, misogyny and laziness make it just very
Mm.
difficult for it to happen. I
Right.
I think that's the hardest piece for people to quite understand, is that the power dynamic and the way that, even like I was taught as a girl, growing up, somebody that read as a female, that like my that sex was really, first of all, it was something that I had to like protect, because it would always be like taken from me in some way. Um, and then additionally, it was supposed to be something that like the man almost like instructs me, or like finds my pleasure, right? Because I wasn't ever given a vibrator as a young woman. I know
Right.
Dan Savage talks about uh, that he believes young girls should be given vibrators like as teens, because they should know how to masturbate. And a lot of women and a lot of our bodies, folks with clitori or clitorises, they are requiring, folks with a clitoris, there we go. They are requiring more stimulation for whatever reason. It's just the way our bodies function. But
Right.
we see, even in psychology, right? Like Freud did all of this shit about how, there's like like if you can come while being penetrated, well, guess who was doing the penetration? That was somehow
Mm.
higher level and better and more important than uh, if you were coming by out, like outer course, or out, outside touch, right? Or just stimulating your clitoris. So
Right.
even back in the foundations of psychology, there were all these rules that were male driven about what gets to be good or bad. And I hear it all the time. Like, I've got a lot of dudes that are like, well, why isn't she lubricated? And then other women that are worried about, like, why am I not lubricated? And it's like, okay, hold on. We don't think about, like, the vaginal canal. If you're taking antihistamines and you have like a dry throat or a dry mouth, well, guess what? Your other orifices are going to be a little dry too. That's
Right.
what antihistamines do. Other
Yeah.
medications often do this. Dehydration can do this. Different sensations, times of the month can do this, where your lubrication may vary. Additionally, there are two ways that we can become aroused. There is sort of thinking yourself aroused, so your body goes, oh, that's sexually relevant material. Sometimes it even happens in things that we don't really intentionally find arousing. Like if you're watching a scene on a show and it's not great, and you're like a rape scene or something, but you're also feeling like some sort of arousal, that doesn't mean that you like that. It just means that it's
Right.
sexually relevant material, and your body just says, oh, this is how I respond to sexually relevant material. So people often
Yeah.
freak out because they're like, why am I turned on by certain things? And it's like, okay, turning on is like in the brain. Your body may have reactions. That doesn't matter.
But this can be like a big thing with anxiety too, not to interrupt
Right.
you, but that can lead to all sorts of crazy shit.
Totally.
So,
Policing your thoughts, feeling like something gets to be better or worse, right? Any of that. So then we have, you've got relevant material. Your brain goes, oh, okay, let's get the body ready for something sexual. And so it releases nitric oxide. And when we release nitric oxide into the genitals, we experience a swelling or engorgement, right? For folks that have penises, this will often equate a erection. For folks that have vulvas, this will usually equate like fluid and swelling, maybe even some blood flow, right? The genitals will typically turn a little bit more pink or red, depending. And so this is all really normal and fine. But as we age, that shifts. And one of the things that like nobody talks about with men is that typically men around 35 to 40 start requiring actually stimulating in order to develop that nitric oxide, that we're no longer able to think ourselves hard or think ourselves wet in the same way. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It just is less likely to happen as we age. Interestingly, in heterosexual couples, most women report higher satisfaction in these later years. And typically it's because there's more touching and more time, right? It's not just, I'm hard, let's put it in.
Right.
It's
Right.
like, oh, yeah, we were stroking and touching and kissing. But I think a lot of dudes around anxiety will be like, oh my gosh, like I'm not hard yet. And I'm like, well, how much, who's playing with it? Like, what are we doing with it? And they're like, nothing. And I'm like, okay. Like, when you masturbate, right, you typically go hand to the dick, let's do this, right? Or hand, like, let me just
Yeah.
start rubbing it on stuff. Like, you're creating that nitric oxide effect. And that's what people, I think, don't realize. Like, we can play with that and really encourage that outside of, and it can actually be really fun and enjoyable. Um, you know, so there's these two pathways.
Right. I mean, I want to jump back real quick to
Mm-hmm.
something, but then I want to jump back over here because just to sort of recap where we're at already. No, well, number one, slow the fuck down, right?
Yeah.
Like really slow down, maybe learn to enjoy it, be more grateful for the smaller things that lead to the bigger things. Schedule your sex, schedule your foreplay, right? So that's number two. Number three, my favorite one personally is like have a real conversation with your partner, with yourself, right? What do you like? What do you not like? Like take the emotion out of it, I would say, right? Because I know it's so hard to do, but like, sounds like that's what you're saying is like, have this conversation because how do you know if he or she is going through this or that or whatever and they're not going to tell you? Well, you should ask. So we've got those sort of
Yeah.
recap, right? um Going back, okay, so how do you think it would go over in Texas if we gave everyone a vibrator?
I mean, I think in some
I,
states they're still illegal. So,
oh
like,
my
or
God,
yeah, in
really?
some
No
states, I believe
way.
like dildos are still illegal. Um, Yeah, I mean, this is where some states I believe sodomy is still legal. I could be wrong on that, but
What?
if it changed, it hasn't changed like recently, or that I know of. But I mean, that's like something that we still are talking about. I know, like when you look at um, for the LGBT community, when they're looking to travel, like one of the things they search for is sodomy laws because oftentimes that is a really good indicator that you will be persecuted. There's also anti-homosexuality laws. I mean, just blatant ones, right? But
Yeah.
there's been several things around like deviant acts that people are getting punished for. And so I think yeah, I mean, there's a lot of. It's funny because usually in very conservative circles, we see that there are a lot more swingers, and in more liberal circles, we see folks being more in like open relationships. And
Right.
so it's funny because like everybody's fucking, like it's
Right.
just in different ways.
Right. Exactly. I mean, that makes total sense. And maybe that's what's wrong in Texas and Florida is like they're not allowed to have dildos or something. Like, what is going on? What the fuck? I had no idea that was still.
I should look that up before I'm
Oh
like
my
quoting it. But
God.
yeah, I mean,
Well,
I don't know, like, but I do know some states have it. Yeah. And I mean, look,
wow. Yeah.
Florida is definitely having lots of sex. I lived there for 2 years and worked
Yeah.
at Planned Parenthood and the hospital. So sex was being had there. That is not a
Yeah. I
shortage.
mean, I've been to Miami quite a few times. So come on. Yeah, of course they are. But it's like to have sex and then burn the witch over someone else's dildo or vibrator
Yeah.
or sexual preference. Like, that's insanity.
I think we
That's
do that a
insanity.
lot in our culture where we really like having sort of like the demonizing of like certain aspects or components or whatever. And, I mean, that's again, it's sort of trying to maintain a status quo. And that's what a lot of white supremacy and misogyny and capitalism, like they all try to reinforce the current systems. And so, you know,
Ugh.
I hope that um, what we're really trying to ultimately go at in all of this is like, can there be some flexibility, right? Where are the ways that we want to have boundaries? And where are the avenues that we also need to be a little more flexible? And I could go on and on about like dating and relationships and the culture we have around that, around fidelity, around who owns whose sexuality. I
Right.
mean that's realness, and I think a lot of people haven't really given it. I don't think um, good thought or examination about why we have the rules we have.
Yeah.
And
I
what the
mean,
fears are that are coming up, and are those actually realized. The idea of giving kids sexually relevant, honest sex education, it typically is they're going to have it more. And yet we know that some are like, we know education delays the onset, that the more we're talking about it, that the more delayed the onset is. And even if it isn't delayed, then they're at least making more educated decisions, right? And so I think there's kind of a discrepancy that we have about this, like who gets information, who gets to police or determine the information, and how it's
yeah.
disseminated, all of that.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but for a very long time it was religion, right?
Yeah, I mean, religion plays a big role, and I'm really trying not to, more and more as I'm trying to be more
Right.
flexible and like hold space for the both and. Like, there are a lot of challenges in religion around the way that they approach human variability and the way that they have policed bodies, the way that they have determined what gets to be normal or acceptable. So there's a lot of garbage. And also I want to create some space that there's a lot of healing and community that also comes from it. So I don't want to take like a hard stance of like it's all garbage. And at the same
Yep.
time I want to really acknowledge the fact that like religion has done a lot of harm to a lot of people, while also offering certain people healing. And I think religion has its own elements of white supremacy and various isms within it that make it very hard for, or make it easy for a select group of folks to really benefit from religion.
Right. Yeah, yeah, and you can really tell because now some of those effects that were established way back when, we're seeing this sort of like confusion and hopefully like a breakaway from that stuff now. It's just stuff has lasting effects, it's the ripple effect for sure. That's why I asked. Um okay, so with sexual anxiety and shame, I guess plays a little bit into this too, but with if you're in a situation with a partner, and I, I've been in a situation on both ends where it's like you're starting to get it on and she goes for your dick or whatever it is, or vice versa, and it's like, oh, you're not even wet to the girl, or the girl's like, oh, you're not even hard to the guy, and then that creates like a something's wrong with me sort of shameful, I
Right.
should be hard, or the woman's like, I should be wet. Like,
Right.
I feel like that happens a lot, especially in just like, hey, we just met, for me usually it's like out at a bar or something, it's like somebody I barely know, like whatever, and those things can happen, and like I said, I've been on both ends of it. Instead of saying that and making the other person feel like complete trash, how do you deal and adding to their anxiety, right? How do you like how do you navigate those sorts of situations, because I feel like a lot of people are adding to the other person's anxiety without
A
really even
hundred
knowing it.
percent. 100%. Yeah. I mean, because we get so, there's like this sort of scenario where a couple is trying to engage and then it doesn't happen the way that either thinks it's okay, like is what they wanted. And so then they like turn away from each other and they're just like, facing away and like sad. And one of the things that I do in my work, and I think a lot of therapists do, is they ask people like, okay, what was going through your mind? And I remember couples were also often like, well, she's so disappointed and like embarrassed, and she thinks I'm a terrible lover, and the female partner was like, well, I feel guilty because I'm supposed to be like a good girl, but I'm kind of doing a bad girl thing by having sex outside of wedlock, and I feel a lot of guilt around it, and obviously he doesn't find me as attractive. And like they both sort of looked at each other and they're like, what? Like we had no idea that that's what the other person was thinking. um and they were both feeling so insecure and like that they were, terrible lovers. And so one of the things that I love to ask people to do is think about like, what kind of lover do you want to be, and how do they show up in moments that are really challenging? I have this like really awesome human that I work with where he really wants to be like alpha, in bed leader, like take charge kind of dude. And sometimes his penis has not been as erect as he's needed it, or she requires like touch that is outside of his penis or his hands, or she didn't really know how she could orgasm, and so he was just sort of like feeling like he was fumbling, and that made him feel really incompetent. One of the reframes that we did is like, well, how does a strong confident leader like lead sexually, right? So one of the things he started doing was like asking her like, what does this feel like, show me what you like, right? And like kind of telling her what to do. So he's getting to be the alpha, right? And then being the alpha around vulnerability. So afterwards, when it didn't happen quite the way he'd want or whatever, he would turn to her and be like, hey, what's going through your mind? So now he's being this like brave, fearless badass that's like, I'm going to show up for your emotions. And she's like, oh, I was feeling like you don't like me. And he's like, I'm super attracted to you. I am super into you. And she's like, fuck yes, this is dope. Like,
Yeah.
suddenly it shifts the whole dynamic. I'm not saying that they both didn't still have some disappointment. Like, yeah, we have disappointment. That's normal.
Hmm.
And at the same time, I think, figuring out sort of what kind of lover you want to be so that you can then figure out like, how do we lead during these moments where it's not as uh, you know, as the way we envisioned it. How do I show up in that way? And that can hopefully help reframe for people a little bit of some of that discomfort where it's like, oh, I really want to be a giving partner. Well, how are you showing up in that giving way? If you're just going, well, give me your orgasm, or I want this orgasm, why aren't you having it? That's not being a giving partner.
Right. Yeah, no, not at all. It's the opposite, actually. Yeah, I mean, even in my own experience, I dated this girl for a while, and it was one of those situations. It's happened more than once, and where she would just like kiss me on the cheek or on the neck or something, and then she would like immediately go for my dick, and be like, "You're not even hard." And I would be like, before I could even say anything, she'd be like, "Who is she?" And I just like, who is she? You know what I mean? Like she would lose it. Like you don't find me attractive
Right.
whatsoever. I mean, within 30 seconds, she was standing up, like, get out, like, and I'm like, hang on a minute, listen, you know, let's rewind.
So PSA for and here's another way. I'm gonna keep sounding like a broken record.
Good,
That
do it.
misogyny fucks us all.
Yeah.
Because what misogyny does is it puts all the onus, like relationship security is dictated by the dick. And so, like, if you, like, as women, we are only valued as sexual objects. And this idea of, and because of that, that's where we get our power. And so having to navigate that, that means that we are constantly in anxiety around this idea that there is a constant barrage and threat. One, it treats men like they're just sort of like these animals that like are just like, throwing shit on the wall and humping random things, and it's like, I think, and sometimes that is really empowering, or not empowering. That feels powerful for men to be able to be in that space, and we really glorify it often. But most men that I know and work with do not feel that at all. And so there are a lot of challenges for like where women are taught to constantly assess, and particularly heterosexual women are taught to constantly assess the threat. And that if we are not maximum desirability, right, which means adhering to a very sort of like ableist white, thin conventional framework, then our desirability goes down, which means of course he may stray, or of course he may do. And it's like, first of all, ladies, we are not in charge of regulating anyone's behavior. There could be a I don't know, my ideal human being naked in front of me, being like just one night, like all I want, and saying all the right things to me, and I am not going to break my agreement. Now, people are like, oh, yeah, well, because you're a girl, that makes sense. But there could be a super dope chick that is naked with golf clubs and some meat and something else in front of my husband, being like, just one night. And he'd be like, I'm not breaking my agreement. Now, I don't have a guarantee on that. I mean, maybe, I don't know. But like, this is part of trust, right? Is this idea that like we have an agreement, and ours right now centers around monogamy. But that's our agreement, right? And that doesn't mean like all of these things can happen, and that doesn't mean that they do anything differently. And I have no control over his behavior. And accepting that has been so hard, but also very freeing. And I think for men to also accept variability, for men to accept vulnerability, it's the same thing. It's really hard and very freeing.
So how can people do that though? Can you just expand on that a little bit? Like, how can people actually say, listen, I don't own this person. I'm in an arrangement with this person. We made an agreement because I want to, or because I love
Yeah.
them, or whatever. How do they let go of? Well, yeah, they might cheat on me, or yeah, they whatever. Like, how do we stop the like? Let me see your phone at 4 a.m. and like all that.
Right.
How do we get away from that?
Right. I think it's like a twofold issue. So sometimes this is a mismatch of crazies. And the way that I describe this is, when I was dating a lot of guys, a lot, that's being very generous. When I dated the select ones that I did, the good news is I learned a lot. The bad news is I had to go through some garbage to get to some good stuff. And one of the things that I often did was I was like, hey, so like I'm interested in being in a relationship. And I'd get like, oh, don't put ball and chain on me. Like, look. And I'd be like, wait, I'm not asking to marry you. Like, I don't even know if I really like you, but I'd like to be in this agreement, like, or this like relationship. Like, this feels weird. And what I would do is go, oh, I'm just needy and ridiculous. And obviously, like, this is silly. So I just need to get over it and do what my partner wants, which is like be super chill and like carefree and whatever. And the problem is that that was crazy making.
Mm.
And so it would be like, I would have a partner that would like, hey, let's go out and hang out, and then not show up. And I'd be like, oh, I'm just not chill enough. Right. And it was like, no, this makes me nuts. And instead of going, oh, I need a human being that can show up. So it's funny because when my husband and I first got together, our first date, I was like, just so you know, I want a long term relationship. And he was like, yeah, me too. And then I was like, I think probably even later on in the date or whatever. Oh no, he was traveling a lot when we first got together, which was actually really great because I had to practice being connected while also being like separate.
Mhm.
And that was something that was really hard for me at first. And so one of the things that I realized was I really needed someone to like call or check in on me, or me to check in. Like I wanted some sort of contact at least once a day at that time because we were new. I didn't know him. It was hard for me to build trust when he's like out of the, state 45 of the first 60 days we were together. Like, it was hard. And so I just said to him one day, like, hey, I really need more communication. And he was like, oh, okay. But one of the things that's hard is like if I call you after I've been traveling or working all day, we get into these conversations, right? Because I'm a talker. We get into these conversations that are like an hour plus, and I'm just really tired and sometimes need to go to bed. So, what a compromise looks like is okay, so we will reach out, but you will tell me when, like, hey, I'm just going to say goodnight. I got to go to bed. And I'm going to let you go. Right. And so this was me being able to allow his crazy and me to own my crazy. Right. And be like, oh, yeah, we can navigate this.
So
Does that make
so
sense?
basically what I'm getting from that, just to put a finer point on it, is to be communicative with your partner, but also to be honest, really honest enough to build trust, right? Is that what?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think everybody needs to know they're crazy. And a lot of times people think they need to be whole or perfect or whatever. But look, I've got my, like, I always say, I've got my own level of crazy.
Right.
And sometimes it matches really well with humans and sometimes it doesn't.
Right.
And for a while, and still sometimes I internalize that as my failing, that I'm supposed to just undo aspects of my crazy rather than, like, for example, most of our traits have a both and. So, like, I'm a really passionate person, I'm a very emotional person. And instead of me being like, oh, which is what I've been told growing up, like, you're too much, you need to tamp it down, don't do that. Instead, what I've really learned is like, oh, some people really love this about me. They like this energy, they like what I'm bringing to the table. And so I need to focus my energy there rather than, and just realize that like the people that don't like me, it's a mismatch. It's not because they suck or I suck. And I think oftentimes we want to determine who sucks when something is a mismatch
Right.
rather than just being like, oh, it's not your fault or my fault. We just want different
Yeah.
things,
Totally.
right? And I think couples sometimes will either talk around the thing that they want,
Yeah.
or uh, they will try to fit the other person.
Yes.
And those are not compromises, right? Those are these sort of acquiescence or ways that we kind of try to tamper ourselves. And that just isn't sustainable. So typically couples realize after a while, like, oh, I can't maintain
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. I mean, that to me is like forfeiting. You're forfeiting a piece of yourself, and then later, when that piece of yourself is like, "Hey, man, it's time to have some fun," or whatever, you can't, Oh, well, now I hate this person because they made me forfeit this piece of me. And I've been in relationships. I used to throw parties for a living, basically. So you can imagine all the fun shit that comes with that, all the craziness, all the like mind warping things that
Right.
happen. And I met, some really great women who I dated, and I met some people that we weren't a match. But sometimes what would happen was I would start to date someone and they'd love it, right? And 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months in, it would become a thing. Like, oh, like
Right.
they would get, and I was like, you can't get mad because you leased a Honda Accord. Not that I'm a Honda Accord. I don't know. I would like to think I'm more of a Maserati, but whatever. Well, for this for this example,
Well, you need to find somebody that like sees you as that Maserati,
yeah,
right? Like that's the
yeah,
thing is that we often say like, oh, how, like, I mean, the dudes that I dated, I think all were like, they would say various different things about
Right.
me, right? Like crazy, unreasonable, like, I mean, I didn't leave, like, we didn't break up in these like ridiculous fashions, but like, I mean, that was
Sure.
something. And so I was like, always being like, oh, I'm the problem. And then what happened was, is that I started finding human beings that were like, you're fucking
Right.
dope. And I was like, oh,
Yeah,
okay.
totally. I mean, there was one girl that I dated, and she was like the total opposite, and she was like helping me put my tie on, and like, go get him, baby. Like, you do that thing that you do with your whatever, And she was like, I was like, wow. And you know what happened? I fell for her super hard. But
Yeah.
no one was comfortable with themselves to do that. I feel like they were very threatened by the idea that I was out there. There was a lot of women. There was no trust, and it didn't always work out great. But that was sort of an example from my life where it's like you meet somebody, you see who they are, how they are, what they're capable of, what they're doing. You get in the relationship with them anyway. You pretend like you like it, and then later on down the line, and it happens all the time. I see it
Right.
all the time, which is insane.
Well, and I think, I think there's also times to like give things some time, and sort of see how things unfold. Like I tell people to think about them as like red flags, yellow flags, green flags, right? And if I tell people, typically you're going to want to know, or I always say like use red flags sparingly. Like I think a lot of people think, oh, I just need to like log all the red flags, but then they also don't talk about it,
Right.
right? So, for example, if a red flag is, oh, they have no money in savings, or they spend money, or whatever, or they have a lot of debt or whatever, then it's like, okay, so let's make that a yellow flag and talk about finances and what that would actually look like, right? Hey, I want to talk about finances. Now, maybe that's also not a part of where your relationship is in that moment. Okay. But then thinking about like, how might I ask them about this? Like, hey, how do you see finances in your future? Just to like get general ideas, right? Rather than making
Sure. Yeah.
assumptions.
I mean, again, we're coming back to this universal theme of this episode, which is like, if you want to not crush the anxiety, but if you want to manage the anxiety, the first step to doing that, to trusting someone, to trusting yourself, to being a part of something, is to talk about it, to communicate with your partner, and communicate with yourself too. I would add in there, like, be honest about it. So I feel
Yeah.
like that's what we've tackled. I have so many more questions for you, but it would not. We would be here for another 3 hours. And
Yeah,
yeah,
I could go on and
yeah,
on. Next time we'll like really like try to narrow it down. Like we can be like dating anxiety, like
yeah,
dick
right.
anxiety, vulva anxiety.
Yeah.
Like we can talk
But I
about it
think,
that way or
we
something.
I think I mean, what do we nailed this shit. We fucking nailed it.
We're
Yeah.
wetting the
Yeah, we got
whistle.
it. We did it.
I did find Alabama is no sex toys.
Are we
That's
really
I think the only
surprised
one.
though? I mean,
No,
Alabama, for God's sake.
no, right.
Jesus.
Um, yeah, that's from a 2017
Oh
HuffPo. So
God, yikes.
I just wanted to make sure that I'm not out there like
No, I'm glad
proliferating
you came in and
terrible fake
yeah,
news,
oh
like
God.
garbage.
Throw up.
Sorry.
Yeah, no. So Alabama, no dildos. Good luck, guys. Yikes. Yikes. I'm so not surprised though. Wait, why can't we start a war
Yeah,
over that? Like, we had, come on, jeez. Anyway,
I would be
me
pissed.
too. I would totally, yeah. We should send every female in Alabama a case. We should get someone to sponsor it and just send them a case of dildos.
Me too.
Seriously. Melissa Novak, thank you so much for being here. Like, you're
Thanks.
incredible. Your insights are invaluable. I would love to have you back if you would, brave the storm and come back
Sure.
again. That would be amazing. But yeah, until next time. Thank you guys.
Yeah, good luck with everything. Have a
Thanks.
good one. Take care of yourself. Bye.
Let's all take a deep breath. Okay, we did that. We did that together, right? I want to thank Melissa Novak for being on the show. I just think we should probably get the women in Alabama, some help, right? Listen, if you guys are feeling lovey, if you're in a loving mood, there's a couple ways you can show that. You can subscribe if you're listening on platforms like Spotify, on Apple. You could subscribe, yeah, only if you want to. You could subscribe. You could also leave a review if you're feeling lovey. If you're watching this on YouTube, hey, what's up? You can you can comment, you can subscribe there too. If you want to chat with me, if you want me to, do a dance that I won't do, or you want to tell me something about your grandmother, whatever it is, you can DM me on Instagram. You can DM me on Twitter. You can also get really excited to meet me back here next week, because I am already excited to see you then. And I will see you then. Bye.
Thanks for listening. The party continues next week. Click subscribe and let's make this a regular thing. Follow the show on Instagram and Twitter @SexPartyFM. Follow Dustin @Dustin Rybka.